Avowed seems to be a really contentious game. When the game was initially revealed, I was open to it because I played the two Pillars of Eternity games a couple of years ago for the first time and absolutely loved them. And while I would have preferred to see a Pillars of Eternity 3, I was definitely willing to entertain the idea of a first-person fantasy RPG in that universe, especially considering Bethesda has gone MIA in terms of Elder Scrolls. At the same time, early footage wasn't exactly inspiring, and I was very skeptical of what this game may turn out to be. While I wasn't exactly sure what to expect, what we ended up getting certainly wasn't Elder Scrolls, though where I differ with a lot of what I read online is that I'm perfectly okay with that. Because I honestly wasn't sure about this title, I initially played this by signing up for a 2-week trial to Game Pass for $1. I figured I couldn't lose no matter what the quality of the game was. Before that trial expired, Microsoft reached out to me to offer a 1-month PC Game Pass code, which works out well because I'm still not done with the game yet and my 2-week period is fast closing in on me. I had no idea this offer was coming, and I had nearly finished the script before this happened, but that said, it doesn't impact my opinion on the game at all, and everything I'm about to say is completely honest, restricted to only my personal views and experiences with the game. Even though I'm quite a few hours in, these are still initial impressions, and I am nowhere near finishing the game. It's huge, so keep that in mind if there are things I don't mention or overlook. I'd like to start with what I really like about the game, the combat. I didn't pay much attention to the pre-release media on this game, so for the most part I was going in blind, outside of knowing it's a first-person title in the Pillars universe. But damn, does the combat feel satisfying to me. Melee feels really good, and I love the slight delay on hit, making the encounters feel tactile in nature, giving some weight to the movement. Hit animations for the enemies and ragdolls are solid as well, making the shield play pretty enjoyable. I didn't plan to go sword and shield necessarily to start, but enjoyed trying to parry and whatnot so much I naturally kept going in that direction. Magic is weaved into this very well, and players aren't restricted by class, something I was initially concerned about. I like the old school class systems in games, so when Skyrim further eviscerated classes, for example, I wasn't too happy about it. Suffice to say, I felt the same upon learning there weren't restrictions in Avowed, but I think it works out well enough. There are quite a few skills in each of the skill trees: Fighter, Ranger, and Wizard, and you do not get an abundance of skill points to distribute, making choices actually matter. While all characters can access some spells by equipping grimoires, a focused wizard build is going to have much faster spellcasting and more powerful spells. So while you can have a sort of omni character, the further you spread your abilities, the less focused you'll be. But I find it to be a decent balance for the most part. Notably, you can respec at any time both stat and skill points for relatively cheap. So if you pick up some new weapon and decide you really like it, you can respec your template around it going forward. Either way, it's a nice sweet spot between available skill points and skills to create custom classes and builds however you like, while still being limited enough to not feel like an Omni class. However, I don't believe they nailed the difficulty. I started on hard mode, and while there was some initial challenge adjusting to the game and learning the basics, that quickly left and I began to think I should jack it up to Path of the Damned, the max difficulty. The only reason I didn't to begin with is because that difficulty level is very punishing in Pillars of Eternity, and I figured the same would be true here, but it's not. While I was challenged in the first zone, by the second zone I was starting to mow down enemies. Granted, I tried to do a lot of the side content, but still, I expected it to be a lot harder on the maximum difficulty. At this point, I can't imagine how easy it would be and how quickly enemies would go down if I were playing on normal. But speaking of zones, the game is open but zone-based, similar to other titles like The Outer Worlds or even Baldur's Gate 3 to some extent. The travel freedom within the zones is absolute, for the most part, but you are gated by the main quest in terms of access to later zones. What really shines about these areas though is the design, exploration, and how you get around in them. One of my favorite features of the game is the parkour and movement. It feels amazing. I'd liken it to something like Doom Eternal in terms of platforming. Most of the areas are designed with verticality in mind, and it makes for great experiences scaling different areas either to find some hidden materials, a weapon, or just to get a better lay of the land. Your movement speed and parkour speed can be further augmented by skills, stats, and even equipment. In these zones, you'll find side quests, which can be more interesting than the main quest in some cases. Crafting materials, unique weapons, and simply points of interest that help lay out the environmental storytelling, complementing the plot to some extent. It doesn't hurt that the game and zones seem to be absolutely beautiful. I think Avowed does a great job of bringing the Pillars of Eternity look into 3D. Some of the areas are downright jaw-dropping, especially some specific locales. The main quests, so far anyway, are relatively short affairs, but there is a great deal of side content available, including full-blown side quests and smaller scenarios like bounties throughout each zone. Some of these side quests are relatively small in scope, such as one that asks you to climb around the rooftops in a seaside shantytown seeking lost pieces of an amulet, while others are much larger and greatly add to the user experience. One such quest was to track down a lost expedition that I acquired in Paradise. I expected this quest to lead me to some generic cave and fight a generic boss with a quick resolution, but I was surprised to find that it was a full-on dungeon experience with supplemental plot elements, to the point where I feel like this should have been involved in the main quest. Speaking of, the dungeon design so far is pretty commendable. While they are still linear corridors in the end, there are often hidden areas to find that aren't always explicitly pointed out like you may find in other games with yellow paint syndrome. Sometimes there are even secret areas within secret areas. While most of the time loot is limited to crafting items, occasionally there will be unique items to be found as well. Crafting supplies can also be gained by breaking down equipment you don't need, both regular items and unique items. The better the item, the better materials you'll receive from breaking it down. You can also augment the enchantments to some extent on unique items, but I haven't messed around with it too much, honestly. Crafting supplies also shouldn't be overlooked in terms of value though, because upgrading your equipment is one of the key elements of power escalation in the game, and some of these resources become quite scarce. Avowed is similar to Pillars in that enemies do not respawn, so the elevation of your character's power is somewhat curated in nature. In addition to that, there is no level scaling, so it is entirely possible to stumble into a battle or group of enemies that will absolutely wipe the floor with your face until you level up, upgrade equipment, or both. This is definitely refreshing in a sea of level scale games out there. I would love to see much more of this, industry-wide. While I wasn't convinced with dialogue options and choices at first, it does seem that there are choices you can make that have changes to the story. And the best that I can tell is that some of these are leading up to some primary endgame changes. It's hard to say because I have a lot left to go, despite dropping 20 to 30 hours on this game already. I've only just entered the third zone, and I accidentally missed a lot of side quests at some point, because you can progress the story to the point where a lot becomes unsolvable, something I honestly didn't expect and was surprised to find. I resisted the urge to reload my save and tidy up, deciding to go forward with my decisions and actions in general. The game is much bigger than it initially lets on, and you realize this the further you get into it. Though if you simply beeline the main story, you can likely wrap things up relatively quickly, but you'll be missing a lot of quality content in terms of side quests and just enjoying the exploration of the map. Rest assured though, there are decisions to be made while playing this game, and I look forward to where they go in some cases especially. That said, while at the beginning of my playthrough, I wasn't sure I'd be revisiting the game. The more that I play, the more I feel the desire to start a new character, choose a different build, and make polar opposite decisions on another run of the game. I know of at least one absolutely major decision that can be altered with different decisions that happens relatively early on in the game and is awesomely implemented. Instead of being just some quest you pick up and a follow marker, you're expected to pick up on hints from NPCs, the environment, and more. But the change, if you do pursue it, is pretty massive in terms of the story. There's a lot more going on in this title than what it appears at first. The dialogue and decisions have grown on me. The same can be said of the main quest, party members, and dialogue related to them. I really wasn't that impressed initially, but the further I get into the story, the more I like all of it. There is quite a lot of Pillars lore here, so those that have played the first two games in the universe will be at a clear advantage, but the game offers a real-time lore explanation during dialogue similar to, though not as good as, what was offered in Final Fantasy XVI. This game takes place just a few years after the two prior games, so all the happenings in these games are still relevant in Avowed. Regardless, the lore dumping is nowhere near as intense as it was in the first Pillars of Eternity game. I felt absolutely assaulted with proper nouns and story details when starting that game, but in the end I'm glad I stuck with it because the lore in the universe is rich and in my opinion really pays off. Hopefully that's the case with Avowed as well. I mentioned that Elder Scrolls Avowed is not, but in the end I'm alright with that because very few games compared to Elder Scrolls in general. The game that most closely resembles the feeling I get from Elder Scrolls in the past decade or so would easily be Kingdom Come Deliverance, which I made an initial impression video on when I first played it a year ago. I absolutely loved that game and very much view the series as a challenger to the throne in many ways, despite not featuring fantasy elements and so forth. Avowed is not designed that way. I'd say it's closer to something like Mass Effect or a BioWare RPG in terms of the experience. The companions especially so, considering they only have skill trees, which are used from a radial menu in combat. The first companion you acquire though, Kai, is voiced by the same actor as Garrus, so it also lends to the comparison a bit in my mind. In the end, I'd say Avowed is some kind of hybrid title, but what it does well, it does very well, and I look forward to finishing the game. But not everything is sunshine and roses. There are other aspects that could definitely be improved. I mentioned crafting earlier in terms of equipment, but you can also craft food items for healing and mana restoration. But the crafting menu for this frankly sucks. You can only craft in camp, which is fine, but once you select the cauldron, you enter a new menu and choose what you'd like to make, at which point you then have to manually choose to craft it. Then select how many, then choose to craft it. The problem comes that these items can be constructed from various types of materials and not just one. So sometimes if you want to make 10 of a certain item, you have to choose to craft it several times because of the material combinations. It's a bit of a headache, to be honest. Other things some may complain about is the lack of NPC interactivity. The only time you're able to attack or physically interact with NPCs is when dialogue provides that option, or in certain special circumstances. This doesn't really bother me at all, because as I said earlier, this isn't Elder Scrolls and doesn't have to be, but it may bother some. The towns, for example, feature very few NPCs walking around. I'd say it's very, very rare to see activity of this kind. It's definitely not immersive in that fashion. And while on the subject of interactivity, there aren't many physical items that can interact in the environment. While there are certain types of crates and vases that can be destroyed throughout the environments, most items are not able to be interacted with in any way. Further, items that are able to be picked up are merely for the player, and NPCs have no concern whether you take them or not. So there is no stealing system within Avowed that you may find in titles like Baldur's Gate or Elder Scrolls. Though there are a couple of surprises related to this lack of feature that may surprise you by the time you come across them, as it did me. Many buildings within towns are also not enterable, though some portion of them are. Another issue is the character models themselves. Some look pretty good, but overall there's just some issue with the way they are designed, at least for me, that makes a lot of them look just a bit weird. I'm not exactly sure how to phrase it more accurately than that. There's just something a bit off. Occasionally you will run across an NPC that looks like their face was hit with a brick, for example. Some of the models do look surprisingly good, but it's just a bit of a mixed bag overall. The lip syncing or animation related to speaking is also sometimes very off, and this does bother me from time to time when they make very odd animations in comparison to what words they are supposed to be speaking. Likewise, the voice acting itself is a bit of a mixed bag. The aforementioned Kai is pretty excellent, and so too are most of the party members. But Yahtzee drives me insane, and some NPCs can be a little meh. One more odd choice, almost all of the guard captains seem to be women, to the point where it becomes distracting, and I begin to wonder, what happened to all of the men? This is especially prominent in the earlier portion of the game. It's possible things level out later on, and while I don't normally care, I just couldn't help but notice the lack of voiced male roles early on. For whatever reason, it kept nagging at me as it encountered voiced female after voiced female after voiced female to the point where it didn't feel realistic at all. In terms of bugs or other lack of polish, I didn't find an awful lot so far to complain about. I've had 0 game crashes and only 1 instance of a bug. There was a bounty quest in Act 2 that I was unable to retrieve the trophy that gets turned in for the reward. I tried reloading the game and defeating the enemy again twice, but they never dropped the item I needed to pick up. In the end, I just gave up as it wasn't a big deal, but that's the only problem I've encountered in terms of actual bugs. Overall, the experience feels really smooth. Animations are solid, the vista's beautiful, and the gameplay is fun. While there are a few complaints to be had here and there, it keeps me playing, and I find that I've become even more interested as the game goes on, because I realize there are areas where I could have made a different choice and had a different result. I really look forward to putting more time into this and finishing the game. I absolutely recommend you try it if you're on the fence.